Welcome back to the Wrestling with the Faith podcast, everybody. We're a group of just ordinary churchgoers gathered to discuss biblical passages and talk about what that means to us in our lives in today's world. My name is Evan. I am joined, as always, by Dave and Laurel, our producer, Ben. We're missing Jesse this week, but we're also joined by a couple of guests. We've got Deanna, John, and Pastor Tom joining us today as we talk about Jonah 3:10 through 4:11. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't that what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at the dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" "It is," he said, "and I'm so angry I wish I were dead." But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals?"
Well, I can start. So, when I was a little kid and I read the story of Jonah, all I thought about was, if you run away from what God's asking you to do, he's going to get a big fish to swallow you up. So you better do what God tells you to do. Now, I grew up a Catholic, so you can probably imagine where that might be coming from with my parents. And I got into a little trouble a lot. So you can imagine that was the main message. And honestly, until I got older, I never really knew that the real message was God's forgiveness of people, and that we sometimes don't want to forgive people, and that God does that, and sometimes that aggravates us, right? It's not fair. And I didn't even learn that until, really only a few years ago. The whole time I had my kid's message, the message I learned in Sunday school as a little kid, that if you do something and you're not doing what God's asking you to do, he's going to get the big fish to swallow you. So that was my original message I got out of this story. And so this end part really has a different meaning.
Dave, you got out of it a lot more than I did. When I was a kid, to me it was about, how could a fish swallow up somebody? How could they live there for 3 days? What would they eat? How would they breathe? And so I never even got much beyond that. But it's funny because that's what a lot of people think about, the fish. And you notice in that reading, I didn't hear any whale stories. It was, it's easy to lose focus on that one.
That, and then in what you had sent us earlier, you even said, if you think of Jonah, really it's the fish is only mentioned 3 times, which is less than 10% of the full book. But that's what almost everybody thinks of when you think of Jonah, is the big fish.
Well, what I think is interesting is that God is more gracious, more forgiving than Jonah. And in today's society, in so many ways, especially with the pulling back and forth, politically, maybe we need to think about this. Where does God stand? So easily, so many people, they want to give up. Maybe they don't say, I want to die, but they want to give up or go to Canada. And, what does God say about that?
And also playing off that with everything going on, nowadays, you also see where we're near the end. God is saying to Jonah, well, why are you getting mad about the plant in this case? Why are you getting mad about the plant? You didn't do anything to help with that. You didn't do anything to help it grow. So why is it your concern if you had nothing to do with it other than you got some benefits from it? So it makes me think, kind of going with what you were saying, Deanna, that God would want us to put the effort into water the plant and help it grow, feed it, so that it becomes stronger and it can be used longer by Jonah, but it's kind of watering the word of God to me, and basically watering that amongst everybody else so that the word of God begins to grow, amongst it, even within yourself, but then also amongst anyone around you, and they start to feel the benefit of God's love.
I think there's even a point before that, Evan, and I don't know how deeply we want to get into this kind of thing, but I was thinking about Middle Eastern hyperbole, because Jonah's sitting there watching for 120,000 person city to be destroyed, and here he's concerned about a stupid plant, and just the extreme between those things, and making the point of the trivial things that we make vital, and we miss the most vital thing of all. It's kind of like, the camel through the eye of the needle, just the exaggeration to really drive home the point, and it's our pettiness, and God's graciousness.
I really think about human nature on that. We talked last week a little bit about when some Christians kind of think, well, this is a sin, and we've got it right, and maybe some other Christians have it wrong, or other people have it wrong, and when I think about this, think about, we really want us to be right, and so therefore the people who are wrong, shouldn't they just be punished? And it's that human nature, and instead of God's grace, it's this idea that we deserve the good life, and they, whoever they might be, deserve the bad life.
What a miserable way to live when you think about it. Why should that be any concern of mine? Why should I let you be that much into my head that I'm going to care whether or not God is gracious to you? I mean, I enjoy God's grace, and I think I'm right, but I might be wrong, and we'll just kind of figure it out together, and it's much more peaceful, boy. But churches and Christians do judge.
Yeah, and I think this talks all about that God is more forgiving, more gracious than we are. I think that's part of the message of this. I also thought it was interesting, oops, I said the word, that God repented of the evil. Dave, when you read it, I think there was a different word than repented of the evil. It's like God can change his mind, and I think that's interesting. And I think we talked about that in Interact a couple of times, about how, God can change his mind. God listens to us. Also, God evolves as we evolve. We say if we don't change, we stagnate. Well, is the same true of God? God also can change or not.
I would need to hear a little bit more about that, Deanna. It just struck me as odd talking about God changing.
Yeah, is it God who changes, or is it our understanding of God that changes, I guess? And I get, so that really brings up the whole, you know, who's in heaven and who's in hell, and all of those pieces that we talked a little bit about last week when we talked about sin. And I just that really is, what business is it of mine of whether or not somebody else is in heaven or not, and whether or not they get theirs, right, as opposed to their just desserts or whatever you want to call it. It's such a human thing, and it just seems this passage kind of makes it seem as if God's just so far beyond that, and how petty Jonah is, right, about the stupid plant instead of about all these people, and it just illustrates that God's so far past that he just kind of, you could just see him shaking his head and saying, "What's the matter with you? Why are you more concerned about the plant than 120,000 people?"
I got to jump in real quick because before I forget this, when you were talking about God, what God is really doing when God repents is modeling. This is what I want you to do. And you think about, as a parent, you model, you demonstrate the behavior that you want your children to do. So God repenting of the evil that, he was going to bring upon the city is not that God, oh gosh darn it, I guess I shouldn't have done that. He's modeling about what coming to a new understanding and showing grace and mercy, rather than, well, I guess, God, that's a more helpful way for me to think about than, that God changes his mind from time to time.
Yeah, I was wondering about God evolving as well, especially with our society, how it changes so often with what we, I guess, interpret as right and wrong as the years go by. From thousands of years ago to now, we've changed a lot of our, I guess, ideals or things that we think are important. And so I wonder if he always knew that will happen, kind of thing. So he hasn't really evolved, or he always knows, he's all knowing. So is that evolution, or is that just a good prediction and he knows what we're going to do?
Or is it what we can understand or perceive? Because I think a lot of people consider God of the Old Testament not a vengeful God, but who takes matters, and there's battles and God is telling them to do this in order to win the battle, versus the New Testament, where God is shown as all love. So that might just be us having to change our perception between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The God of love was already there, but it's how we perceive God in the Old Testament versus the New Testament. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, because Christians are willfully ignorant of the Old Testament. And you really do need to see that. Yeah. Not that I've got a football game on the background, but sometimes it's like the Old Testament, God is, the battle's going back and forth, and halftime they come up with a new game plan. Jesus jumps in, takes care of the devil on the cross, and then the game's basically over. But you got to have that one thread of love and reconciliation.
What else do we think about this story when we were little that has changed compared to what it means now?
I think when I was young, I was thinking along the same lines as Pastor Tom. How could somebody survive in a fish for 3 days?
Thinking about how it applies to what's going on today and kind of the pettiness of, Jonah being, well, they were doing evil, they need to be, destroyed or whatever. And it kind of makes me think of, everything that's going on with like the BLM movement. In that, I mean, there's a lot of people that you look at, like what happened to George Floyd, that kicked it all off recently, to where a lot of people are trying to point off, well, he had been arrested, he'd done, X, Y, Z, that, well, he's a criminal. And I mean, it's one of those that, okay, well, in this story, God doesn't, I mean, obviously, unless you do something really like heinous, like God doesn't care about your past as long as you've truly turned away from that and accepted him and Jesus and God's word. And I think that's more of, I think, what his focus is on. And you look at the disciples where they were all, the tax collectors and either the fishermen, like the nobodies, or the people that a lot of society hated for whatever they were doing. And that it really is about that kind of turning point and where you're going to go with your future than where you were from your past.
Yeah, I mean, if you actually read earlier in the story of Jonah, it talks about Nineveh, and they had like child sacrifice, and they did a lot of like really horrible things. I mean, Jonah had every right to think of them as these terrible people, and yet, God's illustration is, it doesn't matter how terrible you think they are; they're worth saving.
Do you want to know something interesting? About 25 years after this story is set, Assyria came in and totally destroyed Israel. They led them away with hooks through their nose, never to be seen again. This is being set in a time where Israel had really isolated itself, tried to purify itself and separate itself from its neighbors. And this is like after the exile in Babylon in 586. And so they've been ruled by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and then Alexander the Great, after he dies, his two generals fight over him. So they've been ruled by these foreign, and how do we keep who we are? And so they totally isolate. And that's where you get all the, the Levitical codes about don't mix this and that, don't mix this and that, and it's just don't chase after foreign gods. So that's what's going on. And rather than coming right out and smacking him with that story, he's telling him the story set in the time of Assyria to make the same point, that God is gracious to those whom we call our enemy. If that, and that might be way more than anybody wants to know. But I think when you know that kind of stuff, you hear a little bit differently, the story.
So I was just thinking about, we talked a little bit ago about, what we thought of it as a kid. And I think I'm probably on the same line as Deanna and Tom. I thought about how he didn't obey what God told him to do, but mostly I thought about how could he be inside that fish and how could he live that long and get spit out, all that stuff. So kind of funny. But then when I just read it again, and of course, in more recent years too, I understand more about the idea of being, of Jonah being so upset at God and not being able to forgive, and, how illustrating how gracious God is. But then when I was reading again, I just saw one little part that it maybe shows there's a little, maybe other reason why Jonah was upset. When after he said he wasn't going to destroy Nineveh, he said, well, that's why I ran away. And he said, I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and filled with unfailing love. I knew how easily you could cancel your plans for destroying these people. And he said, just kill me, I'd rather be dead. But then he said, because nothing I predicted is going to happen. And I thought, maybe a little bit of his anger is because he's saying this is going to happen, and then if it doesn't, people are not going to believe him anymore. So he's kind of upset at that. I don't know. Just a thought there.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to this idea of we as Christians want to say, well, we're doing this right. And so then therefore people who are just, they're mean to other people and they're just working for money and they don't care about anybody else. I mean, they should get what they deserve, right? Isn't that fair? And this idea that God's not fair, which is pretty true, this idea that God's not fair. His grace is out there for everyone, and all you need to do is find it, and you can come back.
Especially from the pride that makes us say something like that.
Yeah.
Because when I look through human eyes, you're right, boy, I see tall trees and short trees. When I fly over the forest, they all look the same height. Then I was thinking about, how does God see us? And I'm thinking he sees us all the same height.
Then you think of the parable, I think it was the other reading for this week, the parable about the workers who, one comes in is working the full day and you get the people coming in, later and later throughout the day, but at the end of the day, the owner ends up giving everybody the same paycheck basically. And it's the same thing that, no matter what we do in our lives, God's giving the same love to all of us. And I mean, it is that the human pettiness or the human condition where, you want to look and point at somebody and say, hey, you're not doing it my way, so you're going to hell or whatever and someone says. But if you want to think about how God really reacts, it's like, well, it doesn't matter. I love you all the same, regardless. And, that's what we should be trying to do as humans. I mean, tying back to the questions of, okay, what's the reading calling us to do or to change or to be? Well, we all have our faults. We're human, but we need to strive to, truly love everybody, no matter who they are. We need to try and give them the same grace that God gives us.
I think one of the ways we learn to do that is I'm thinking of the parable that you mentioned there, Evan. The reason that parable usually ticks me off is because I like to think that I'm the 6 a.m. worker, But if I'm honest, if I really look at my heart and soul, boy, I'm coming in at 5:59, just barely punching the clock. And when you think you're the 6 a.m. worker, it's easy to be Jonah, because you can do that. But I think, that's maybe, I try to be very aware of what's going on in my thoughts and words and deeds. And boy, that in itself keeps me humble in terms of judging. But
Yeah, I think the prodigal son, the classic, kind of story of the prodigal son, where the other son is there the whole time, and this prodigal son who spends all the wealth of his father and then comes back. How dare you, kill the fatted calf for him when I've been here the whole time working? And and that's kind of how you kind of feel when you're trying to live the life that you think God's asking you to do, and this other person hasn't really done it. And how do they get forgiven? And is that fair? And that human nature part of us, and in this, and with Jonah, it's pretty clear that he's saying, hey, who are you to judge? And who are you to be more happy about or more worried about a plant than you are all these people? And really, it's not about you and how great you are. It's about his forgiveness for everyone and his grace to everyone.
Obviously, this week we were talking about, Jonah and how he reacted to God's grace to the people that he believed deserved to be, smited, so to speak. So, let us know if you're watching this on YouTube. Let us know in the comments below what your thoughts are on this subject. If you're listening to this in one of the podcast forms, be sure to find us on social media such as Facebook or Twitter with Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Westlake, Ohio. And be sure to start talking about this with everybody else in your life and see what this passage is calling you to do as a Christian in today's world. So thanks again to John, Tom, and Deanna for joining us this week. And I hope everybody has a great week.